At 9:12 a.m., in a glass-walled conference room still smelling like fresh authority, the new CEO smiled and handed my project to an intern. Just like that. No transition, no questions. Just a quiet replacement, as if 5 years of architecture, sleepless launches, and crisis recoveries could be reassigned with a single sentence. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I signed one document, closed my laptop, and walked out. Because some systems don't fail immediately. They wait. By 9:17 a.m., the meeting had already dissolved into something oddly theatrical. Voices softened, chairs adjusted, eyes carefully avoiding mine, as if proximity to me might suddenly become a liability. The kind of silence that doesn't come from respect, but from recalculation. The intern sat straighter than necessary, fingers hovering above a keyboard that still displayed my system dashboard. My system. Not in ownership, of course. No one owns anything in a corporation. But in the way an engineer recognizes the pulse of something they built line by line, decision by decision. The CEO didn't look back at me. Not once. He was already talking about fresh perspectives and lean execution, using phrases that sounded efficient but felt hollow, like polished steel with nothing behind it. I stood up slowly, not to make a scene, just to mark an endpoint. There's a difference. Access will be transferred immediately, someone from HR said, almost too quickly, as if they'd rehearsed that exact line. Of course it would. I closed the lid of my laptop with a soft click. No drama, no hesitation, just a precise, controlled motion. Around me, the room kept moving, but differently now, like a system already drifting out of sync, just not visibly yet. Because what they didn't understand, what no one in that room paused long enough to consider, was that the project wasn't just a deliverable. It was an ecosystem. Dependencies layered over dependencies, silent safeguards embedded in places no onboarding document would ever capture. Not because I hid them, but because complexity doesn't translate into bullet points. The intern glanced at me once, briefly. There was something there, not confidence, not exactly fear either, more like uncertainty wrapped in ambition, the kind that says, I've been told I can do this. I just haven't proven it yet. I nodded to him, not approval, not disapproval, just acknowledgement. Then I walked out. The corridor outside felt colder than usual, or maybe just quieter. My badge still worked, one last courtesy. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent, like they always had. It struck me how little the environment changes when something significant happens. No alarms, no signals, just continuity, as if nothing had shifted. In the elevator, I caught my reflection for a second. Calm, almost too calm. That's the thing about certain decisions. They don't need to be loud to be irreversible. By 9:26 a.m., I was outside the building. The air hit differently. Not freedom, not relief, just clarity. The kind that arrives when variables collapse into a single outcome. Behind those glass walls, they were probably already restructuring responsibilities. Assigning access rights, forwarding documentation, replacing my name in meeting invites. They would move fast. They always do. But speed isn't the same as understanding. And systems don't respond to speed. They respond to precision. I checked my phone. 1 unread message, then 2, then 5. The CTO hadn't written yet. Not yet. But somewhere inside that building, beneath the polished presentations and confident reassurances, something had already started shifting. Not breaking, not failing, just drifting. Slightly off alignment. The kind of misalignment that doesn't show up immediately. The kind you only notice when it's too late to correct it quietly. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and kept walking, because I knew something they didn't. And for now, that was enough. By 11:03 a.m., my access was gone. Clean cut. No delay. No transitional window. Just a silent revocation that didn't notify me, but didn't need to. I knew exactly when it would happen. Systems like that don't improvise. Inside the building, they were already in motion. I could picture it precisely. The intern sitting in my chair now, slightly leaning forward, trying to absorb everything at once. Multiple dashboards open, logs scrolling, documentation tabs multiplying across the screen like a nervous reflex. And somewhere nearby, someone from management saying, "It's all documented, right?" That question always sounds simple. It never is. Because documentation explains structure. It never captures behavior. By 12:40 p.m., the first inconsistency would have appeared. Not an error, not a failure. Just a delay. A response time slightly outside its usual pattern. Small enough to ignore. Easy to rationalize. The kind of thing that gets dismissed with, probably just a temporary spike. And maybe it was, at least at that moment. The problem with complex systems isn't the visible architecture, it's the invisible agreements inside them. Silent conditions, timing dependencies, fallback paths that only activate under very specific pressure, things you don't learn from reading, only from surviving them. Around 2:15 p.m., someone would have refreshed the monitoring panel again, and again, and again, because once you notice a deviation, you can't unsee it. Metrics don't lie, but they also don't explain themselves. The intern, ambitious, focused, determined not to fail, would start digging. Checking logs, comparing outputs, looking for something concrete, something he could fix. But the system wouldn't give him that, because nothing was broken. Not yet, it was simply misaligned. By 4:32 p.m., a second signal would appear. Slightly louder this time, a queue building where it normally didn't. A process taking longer than expected. Still within acceptable limits, but trending. Always trending. And that's when pressure starts building. Not in the system, but in the room. Why is this happening? Was this here before? Can we roll back? Questions without immediate answers, because rollback requires knowing what changed. And in their minds, nothing had, except it had. They just didn't recognize it as a change. Removing a person isn't a variable on a dashboard, but sometimes it's the one holding everything in equilibrium. By early evening, conversations would shift tone. Less confident, more fragmented. Someone would suggest calling me, not officially, just to clarify something small, but no one would make that call. Not yet, because acknowledging uncertainty requires admitting the decision might have been premature. And organizations resist that longer than they should. By 8:10 p.m., the system would stabilize again, or at least appear to. Metrics flatten, alerts fade. A temporary equilibrium reestablished, not because the problem was solved, but because the system adjusted itself just enough to hold. That's the most dangerous phase, when everything looks fine again. Because that's when people stop looking deeper. That's when they go home. That's when they sleep. And that's when the system starts preparing for the next shift. Not collapse, not yet, just accumulation, because some failures don't begin with a crash. They begin with silence, and 36 hours is a very long time for silence to grow. If you've ever seen a system hold together just long enough to hide what's really happening, you already know where this is going. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter, the CTO opens the report no one wanted to read, and one line inside it changes everything. At 8:46 a.m., exactly 36 hours after that meeting, the CTO opened the report. No one announced it, no dramatic gathering, just a quiet moment at the head of a long table, a screen waking up, and a file name that didn't look urgent, until you noticed the size. $140 million system failure report. The room didn't react immediately, not because it wasn't serious, but because the human brain resists scale at first. Numbers that large don't land instantly. They hover for a second, like something abstract. Then the CTO scrolled. And the abstraction disappeared. Time-stamped entries, cascading dependencies, latency spikes mapped across regions. One failure triggering another, not directly, but sequentially, like a line of perfectly spaced dominoes, falling just slow enough that you could see each one drop. "This doesn't make sense," someone said quietly. It made perfect sense. They just didn't know how to read it yet. By 8:49 a.m., the room had shifted. Chairs leaned forward, voices lowered. The intern was there too, standing this time, not sitting. His screen mirrored on a side display, logs open, commands half-typed and abandoned. He had been trying to contain it. That much was clear. The CTO zoomed into a specific segment of the timeline, a narrow window, barely 6 minutes wide. 9:18 a.m., 9:24 a.m., the exact moment of transition, the exact moment I left the system. "Something changed here," the CTO said. Not loudly, not accusingly, just precisely. That's the difference between leadership and authority. One reacts, the other observes. On the graph, nothing exploded. No red spikes, no catastrophic drops. Just a subtle deviation, one parameter drifting slightly out of tolerance. But that parameter fed into another, and that one into 3 more. And those into systems no one in that room had ever directly worked with, because the architecture had never been flat. It was layered, intentionally. "Why wasn't this flagged earlier?" someone asked. It had been. They just hadn't recognized the signal. The intern spoke then, carefully, controlled. "I followed the documentation. Everything aligned with the expected flow." And that was true. Every visible step had been correct. The problem was never in the visible steps. The CTO scrolled further. Another section, another cluster of logs. Then he stopped, zoomed in, read silently, once, twice. The room waited, because something in his expression had changed. Not panic, not frustration. Recognition. "That's not a failure," he said finally. A pause. "That's a condition." No one responded. Not immediately, because that distinction matters. A failure is something you fix. A condition is something you either understand or you don't. And if you don't, it keeps running, in the background, unnoticed, until it doesn't stay quiet anymore. The CTO leaned back slightly, eyes still on the screen. Who designed this interaction layer? No one answered, not because they didn't know, because they suddenly understood the implication of the question. The intern looked down, not defeated, just aware that he had been solving the wrong problem, because the system hadn't been breaking. It had been following instructions, exactly as designed, just not as understood. And somewhere in that design, there was a dependency no one had documented. Not explicitly, but it was there. It had always been there. The CTO closed the report halfway. Not fully, just enough to pause it. "We need context," he said. Calm, direct, final. And for the first time since the meeting, my absence wasn't procedural anymore. It was operational. Outside, the morning moved on like nothing had changed. Inside, every second started to feel heavier. Because now they weren't asking, "What is happening?" They were asking something far more dangerous. Why? And once that question enters the room, it doesn't leave without an answer. By 9:02 a.m., the word context had already begun to circulate like a quiet escalation signal. Not panic, something sharper, focused urgency, the kind that compresses time without raising voices. Pull historical configs. Compare pre- and post-transition states. Check hidden dependencies. The language changed, not louder, just more precise. At 9:07 a.m., they opened the architecture map, not the polished version from presentations, but the internal one. Layered, annotated, dense. The kind that only makes sense if you've lived inside it. Lines everywhere. Connections that didn't look critical until they were. The intern stood closer now, eyes moving fast, trying to reconstruct intent from structure. That's always the hardest part. Systems don't explain why they exist the way they do. They just are. Start with the interaction layer, the CTO said. Exactly. They zoomed in. At first glance, it looked stable. Controlled inputs, predictable outputs, safeguards in place. But one node, just one, sat slightly outside the visual rhythm of everything else. Not disconnected, not hidden, just positioned differently, subtle enough to ignore, critical enough to matter. Why is that routed like this? Someone asked. No one answered. Because routing implies intention, and intention implies authorship. By 9:14 a.m., they pulled the logs again, this time not looking for errors, but for sequence, timing, order of execution. That's where the pattern revealed itself. Not in what failed, but in what didn't trigger. A fallback that never activated, a safeguard that remained silent, not broken, bypassed. The intern frowned, scrolling faster now. It should have rerouted here, he said, pointing at a branch in the flow. It should have, if the system had interpreted the state as unstable. But it hadn't, because technically, it wasn't. The system believed everything was still within tolerance, and that belief came from a single condition. One variable, small. Almost invisible, but decisive. By 9:19 a.m., the CTO saw it. He didn't react immediately, just hovered over the line, reading it carefully. Once, then again, a conditional gate, not based on load, not based on error rates, based on presence. Silence. Who authorized this logic? Someone asked. No answer, because the logic wasn't unauthorized, it was embedded, deliberately, a long time ago. The intern stepped back slightly, as if distance might change what he was seeing. This doesn't make sense, he said quietly. It made perfect sense, just not from his perspective. The CTO leaned forward. What happens if this condition isn't met? No one needed to run the simulation. They were already watching it. The system didn't fail. It continued, but without safeguards, without rerouting, without correction, like a structure still standing, but no longer stabilizing itself. And over time, that's enough. By 9:23 a.m., the realization settled across the room, not all at once, but in fragments. Expressions shifting, postures tightening, conversations stopping mid-sentence. Because now the question wasn't what broke. It was, what was the system actually built to expect? The CTO finally said it out loud. This condition, it assumes continuity. A pause. It assumes the same operator. Not role, not access level. Operator. That word landed differently. He closed the file slowly. No fallback triggers because to the system. He stopped for half a second. Nothing changed. But something had. And that difference was never meant to be visible. The room went still, because they had just identified the mechanism, but not the intent. And without intent, you don't have control. You just have consequences. The CTO looked around the table, measuring the silence. Then he said the only thing that mattered now. Call her. No hesitation this time, no internal debate, because whatever the system was doing, it wasn't random, and whatever came next wouldn't wait. At 9:31 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown internal extension. No name, no context. Right on schedule. I let it ring once longer than necessary. Not for effect, just to feel the timing. There's a difference between reacting to a system and understanding exactly when it reaches for you. Then I answered, "Hello?" A brief pause on the other end. Not hesitation, alignment. The kind that happens when someone recalibrates their tone in real time. "This is the CTO." Of course it was. "I assumed," I said, stepping aside from the sidewalk into the quiet shade of a building. The city moved around me, cars passing, footsteps echoing, but none of it felt relevant anymore. "We've reviewed the system behavior," he continued. "No preamble, no attempt to soften the situation. There's a conditional dependency tied to operator continuity." There it was, not a question, a statement. "You found it quickly," I replied. Another pause. Shorter this time. "Not quickly enough." Accurate. He didn't waste time. "We need context." There are moments when people expect explanation. This wasn't one of them. This was a moment for precision. "You already have context," I said calmly. "You just don't have interpretation." Silence. Not empty. Focused. Behind him, I could almost hear the room holding its breath. "The system is functioning exactly as designed," I continued. "It evaluates stability based on continuity, not just metrics. If continuity is preserved, safeguards remain passive. If continuity is broken..." I stopped. Let the implications settle. The CTO finished the sentence for me. "The system doesn't recognize instability immediately." Correct. A chair shifted faintly on his side, someone reacting without speaking. "Why build it that way?" he asked. Finally, the right question. "Because reactive systems are always late," I said. "By the time metrics spike, you're already inside the failure window." I built a precondition layer, something that monitors who is maintaining equilibrium, not just what the numbers say. A longer silence now, not confusion. Processing. "You tied system stability to a person," he said slowly. "No," I corrected. "I tied it to consistency of decision patterns. The system doesn't care about identity, it cares about behavior signatures. And when that signature disappears, it assumes continuity for a defined interval," I said, "to prevent false positives during transitions." He exhaled quietly. 36 hours. Yes. The exact window, the one they had just crossed. Behind him, someone whispered something, too faint to catch, but tense enough to matter. The CTO's voice returned, sharper now. And after that, I looked up at the glass facade across the street, reflection shifting with every passing second. "After that," I said, "the system stops compensating." A pause, and starts revealing. Silence, not the passive kind from before. This one had weight. Because now they understood the sequence. The calm, the drift, the delay. All intentional, not to cause failure, but to expose it. "You designed a delayed exposure mechanism," the CTO said. "I designed a truth window," I replied. "The system gives leadership time to recognize a change before it escalates. If they don't..." I let that part remain unfinished. It didn't need words. On the other end, no one spoke for a full 3 seconds. In a corporate environment, that's an eternity. Finally, the CTO said, "We need you back." Direct, unfiltered, not authority anymore, necessity. I didn't answer immediately. Not to negotiate, not to create leverage, just to observe the moment fully. Because decisions like that, returning, re-engaging, stepping back into a system that had already moved on without you, they're never about urgency. They're about alignment. "I'm not the system," I said at last, "and the system isn't failing." Another pause. Then, quietly, "But your timeline is." No response, because that was the real variable. Not the architecture, not the code. Time, and time, once misaligned, doesn't reset easily. "I'll send you a document," I continued. 1 page. It explains what happens next. "What happens next?" he repeated. "Yes." A car passed between buildings, sunlight flashing briefly across the glass. "You're not at the failure point yet," I said. "You're at the threshold." A longer silence now. He understood. "Send it," he said finally. I ended the call without another word. No closure, no reassurance, just a clean break, because the system had already entered its final phase. Not collapse, not recovery, decision, and somewhere, in that quiet room behind a glass wall, they were about to realize something far more critical than a $140 million report. The system had never been the risk. The decision was silence.